Welcome to the Expat Edge with Marcus and Matt, where we answer your questions about becoming an expat to help you thrive abroad. Hey everyone, welcome to the Expat Edge. In this video, we want to tell you why you need a second US passport. Matt, there are so many scenarios that we were just talking about why you would need a second US passport, and probably most Americans don't even realize that you can get a second US passport. What's the first scenario that you would need a second US passport?
Well, I think the first scenario is always surrounded with visas, right? So you've got, let's say you're living somewhere and you've got to send it off to get a visa. I think this is especially also pertinent if you're already abroad. Say you're an American living in, doesn't matter, Vietnam, and you need to travel to two different countries, maybe you need that are both visa related.
Right.
Then you've got to send your passport away. And with COVID, we've seen that, delays in processing visas, it doesn't really matter the country, they've only gone up. Maybe there are some countries that have started more expediently doing visas, but for the most part, it's slowed down considerably. So there's, when you send your passport off to get a visa, it's usually stuck at an embassy or a consulate somewhere for an extended period of time. And if you also need to leave the country that you're in, well, let's just use Vietnam again as an example. You're in Vietnam, you work in Vietnam, you're an American. You have to get a visa to go to Russia. Well, not the greatest example, but whatever, let's use it. You got to get a visa to go to Russia, but then you also have to go to Cambodia, the next week for a business trip.
Right.
You can't do both. And if you send your passport off to get a visa to go somewhere else, then you're stuck in Vietnam until passport's ready with the visa. So that, I think, is the first example. So if you're living abroad, we highly recommend everyone who's living abroad to have two passports. Again, this is mostly for Americans because not all nationalities can have two passports, but I think that's the first example. What would you say is another example, Marcus, of a time when people definitely need to have two passports?
Yeah, besides just the flexibility of being able to send your passport off, getting a visa and traveling while doing that, some other travel document. The second reason is just for in case you lose one of your passports. Yeah. Obviously, you never want to put yourself in a position where you might, get your stuff stolen or, lose a U.S. passport, because it can be a real headache to renew depending on what country you are in at the time,
right? Especially
if you don't speak the language or anything like that. But we've had a few cases where people, they just lost their U.S. passport. They lost their passport, they forgot it, and they never found it again. So they had to get a new passport, then get a new visa, whatever country, to the country that they were traveling to. So I would say, just for safety, it's nice to know that if something were to happen, right. Obviously you're always like, that's not going to happen to me, but you never know. Right.
I think another great reason to have a second passport is if you regularly have to travel to certain countries that have restrictions. The first one that comes to mind for me is if you've been to Israel. There are a lot of other countries in the Middle East that won't let you enter if you've got a stamp from Israel. I've never been to Israel. The Middle East is an awesome place to visit, so I would definitely not want to ruin my chances of going to the other Arabic countries by going to Israel. So you can get around that potential restriction by having two US passports. You can get your stamp in Israel in one passport and travel to the rest of the Middle East on the other passport. There's a few other examples like this, but I don't know of them all, so I'm not going to try to list them off. But those types of situations definitely exist. Cuba in the past, for example.
Well, yeah, Crimea, Ukraine, Russia, like you said, Israel. Definitely, there was a situation with Cuba. Somebody was trying to go to Cuba. I can't remember the details, but they were having this very similar situation where, had they had a second passport, they would have avoided that. Right. The other scenario is simply, some countries you can get a visa and then be in that country for a set period of time, mm-hmm. and then you could one option to continue staying in that country is to leave, get another visa, and then re-enter that country. But it takes 2, 3, 4 weeks, whatever it is, right, to actually get a visa. Maybe you have to fly back home. Whereas if you had a second passport, what you could do is while you're in the country with the first passport and visa, you can apply with your second passport for a second visa to start, the next day or a few days later, and leave the country and then re-enter the country with the second passport and the new visa in the second passport. So there are some scenarios where that's helpful, but it really depends on your situation.
Though I would make sure we are talking about U.S. passports and predominantly about being in the U.S. It's easy to mail a U.S. passport, do whatever you want with a U.S. passport. But with certain countries and passports, that's not okay. And in certain countries, you can't even mail a passport. So just be very careful. We're not, condoning, with a blanket statement that you can send a passport from any country to any other country to apply for visas. Just make sure you're following the law. But yes, there's definitely many situations when that can be helpful.
Right. There are some countries that, you'll go to DHL or FedEx or something, and you'll try to mail your passport, and they'll be like, we can't do that.
Right.
So Ukraine was an example. If you openly say at a DHL service point, okay, I want to mail this document, they'll say what's inside. If you say passport, they're not gonna mail it out. So there are some countries that won't allow you to do that. But yeah, those are a lot of those scenarios are mostly around traveling like from country to country, or traveling each week. I spoke to many businessmen one who comes to mind was a traveling photographer, and he went from country to country trying taking people on tours, and there was no way he could really fulfill his complete his schedule without having a second passport.
Right. And one thing that we probably should mention is that second passports are not good, in the US at least, for 10 years, but they are only granted for up to 2 or 4 years, depends on the circumstance, I guess. I've heard people getting them for 2 years, but usually it seems, according to the US State Department, it's for 4 years. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, when you apply for a second passport, you'll be asked, the reason. Right. What's your reasoning for needing a second passport? And you write a letter, or maybe if you're at a U.S. embassy or consulate abroad, you have, you're there in person, so you explain, I need a second passport for this and this and this. So you do have to have a reason, and we just gave you a ton of them. So use one of those and put that in a formal statement, and they should be granted. Again, 2 to 4 years is typically what they allow. So we hope that that this was helpful. And if you're planning a trip abroad, consider getting a second passport. So, you have peace of mind and you have flexibility of travel. And we'll see you in another video.
This was the Expat Edge with Matt and Marcus. We hope you enjoyed the video. Visit theexpatedge.com for even more content that will help you thrive abroad. You can submit your ideas for video topics and sign up for free at theexpatedge.com. See you there.